June 17th, 2020. A quiet Wednesday morning, and inside the pages of one of the most prestigious scientific journals on Earth, Nature, a team of geneticists in Dublin, dropped a bombshell that instantly rewrote what we thought we knew about the people who built one of the oldest structures on the planet. Buried inside a report about ancient Irish DNA was a single sentence that stopped archaeologists cold. A man interred at the very center of Newgrange, one of the most spectacular Stone Age monuments ever constructed, had been born from incest. Not distant, diluted incest a few generations back. First-degree incest. His parents, according to the DNA extracted from his own skull, were either full siblings or a parent and their own child. And the scientists behind the discovery didn't think this was some tragic, isolated accident. They thought it was proof that a hidden dynasty of godlike rulers had once controlled ancient Ireland, thousands of years before anyone thought such a thing was even possible on this island. Let's set the scene properly, because the location itself is almost as strange as what the DNA revealed. Newgrange was constructed around 3100 BCE, a massive burial mound built from an estimated 196,000 tons of layered earth and stone. The site has featured prominently in Irish culture for millennia, with local folklore eventually placing the region's chief god Dagda and his son inside its chambers. This is not a small pile of rocks. This is an engineered structure so old that it predates Stonehenge and the pyramids of Giza, built by people we tend to imagine as primitive farmers, scattered across a damp island centuries before anyone had invented writing, before bronze, before wheels were common, using nothing but stone tools, timber, and an almost unbelievable amount of coordinated human labor. Antiquarians first rediscovered the site in 1699, but the most serious excavation work only began in 1962, when a team led by archaeologist Michael J. O'Kelly finally cracked open the mound's interior and began mapping what lay inside. And what they found near the heart of the monument was strange from the very beginning, even before anyone thought to extract DNA from it. Most of the bodies found in Ireland's passage tombs were cremated, turned to ash and bone fragments long before burial. But at the very heart of Newgrange, excavators in the 1970s found the unburnt bones of a single man, labeled NG10, resting in a niche decorated with elaborately carved stones. Think about that contrast. Hundreds of bodies across Irish passage tombs reduced to cremated fragments. And then, at the absolute center of the most spectacular one of all, one man left whole, placed inside a chamber carved with symbols that took someone real time and skill to create. Even without any genetic testing, that alone told archaeologists this individual had been treated differently from almost everyone else buried in the Neolithic world. Then, decades later, genetic science finally caught up to the mystery sitting in that skull. Geneticist Laura Cassidy of Trinity College Dublin and her colleagues were able to extract DNA from NG10's petrous bone, the dense portion of bone found deep inside the inner ear, which happens to preserve genetic material remarkably well, even after thousands of years underground. What came back from that sample was the finding that made headlines around the world. A man buried in the chamber of Newgrange around 5,000 years ago was the offspring of a first-degree incestuous union. His parents were either siblings or parent and child. Cassidy and her co-author, Daniel Bradley, studied DNA from 44 individuals buried in various Irish tombs and graves, dating back between roughly 600 and 4,500 years. And out of all of them, only the Newgrange man, the one interred in the largest and most impressive structure of them all, carried these genetic markers of incest. Out of dozens of ancient skeletons pulled from across the island, exactly one showed this signature, and that one happened to be lying in the most important tomb Ireland has ever produced. To understand why this rattled the scientific community so badly, you need to understand just how rare and specific this kind of incest actually is throughout human history. This isn't the kind of accidental inbreeding that can occur in small, isolated populations, where the gene pool runs shallow over generations. This is something else entirely. Such a strategy, which breaks a near-universal social taboo against incest, has historically been practiced almost exclusively by ruling elites in ancient Egypt, in the Inca Empire, and in ancient Hawaii. According to the study's own report in Nature, socially sanctioned matings of this nature are very rare, and are documented almost exclusively among politico-religious elites, specifically within polygynous and patrilineal royal families that are headed by god-kings. That is an enormous claim to make about Stone Age Ireland. Pharaohs married their sisters to keep divine bloodlines pure and unchallenged. Inca rulers did the same, believing their blood was too sacred to dilute with commoners. Hawaiian royalty followed a nearly identical logic centuries later, and now, buried at the heart of Newgrange, was evidence that some kind of parallel god-king structure might have existed in Ireland 5,000 years earlier than anyone had ever imagined, in a culture that left behind no writing, no images of kings, nothing but silent stone monuments and the bones of the people who built them. The scientists didn't stop at just the one skeleton either. They started connecting Newgrange's mysterious man to a much bigger, stranger pattern buried across the entire island. Cassidy and Bradley's team studied DNA from 44 individuals buried in various Irish tombs and graves, and when they compared genetic relationships between people buried in different passage tombs scattered across Ireland, they found threads connecting them that shouldn't have existed by pure coincidence. Distant genetic relatives spread across tombs, separated by real distances, all tied back into patterns consistent with a ruling group whose bloodline mattered enough to track and protect across the landscape, not just within one monument, but across an entire kin-based network stretching over the island. This is precisely why the original team leaned so heavily into the idea of a hereditary elite. It wasn't just one incestuous man in one tomb. It was one incestuous man sitting inside a wider web of genetic connections that looked uncomfortably similar to a royal family tree. The reaction from the wider archaeological world was immediate, and it split almost perfectly down the middle between astonishment and deep skepticism, which is exactly the kind of tension that makes a story like this so fascinating. Some experts were captivated by the sheer audacity of the claim, but others urged real caution. University of Manchester archaeologist Julian Thomas pointed out bluntly, to go from NG Den to saying these are proto-state societies, where you have a godlike elite, is pushing it a bit far. It's one guy, reminding everyone that building an entire theory of divine Neolithic kingship on the genome of a single skeleton is a genuinely enormous leap. Thomas also noted that Newgrange functioned as a burial place for almost 1,000 years, which is far too long a span to draw sweeping conclusions from one single burial that might represent a brief, unusual moment rather than the norm. Cardiff University archaeologist Alasdair Whittle agreed the discovery itself was a really stunning one, but cautioned that social difference in the Neolithic, when it occurs, was often relatively short-lived, suggesting that even if some kind of elite briefly emerged around the time NG10 was born, it likely didn't last for generation after generation the way Egyptian or Incan dynasties eventually did. That tension between an explosive genetic discovery and a chorus of careful scientific doubt sat unresolved for years, becoming one of archaeology's most talked about open questions. Then, 5 years later, an entirely new team of researchers went back to the evidence with fresh eyes, fresh data, and a much larger sample size. And what they found didn't just add nuance to the original incest story. It effectively pulled the whole royal dynasty theory apart at the seams. A reanalysis of ancient DNA published April 2nd, 2025 in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal examined DNA from 55 skeletons found in Ireland's 5,000-year-old megalithic graves, and concluded that these tombs were likely built for entire communities, not for a ruling dynasty at all. 55 skeletons. That's not one lonely genome anymore. That's a genuinely serious data set, more than enough to start seeing real statistical patterns, rather than drawing sweeping conclusions from a single outlier. The study's lead author, archaeologist Neil Carlin of University College Dublin, told Live Science that instead of being royal tombs, these megalithic monuments may have been spots where different groups of people came together in different seasons to work, feast, and bury their dead together, painting a picture that looks less like a pharaoh's private mausoleum and much more like a communal gathering site, something closer to a shared cathedral built by an entire society than the private crypt of a hidden royal bloodline. The specific genetic finding that undermines the original God-King theory is worth sitting with because it directly contradicts what made the 2020 paper so sensational in the first place. Carlin and his team noted that most individuals buried in the passage tombs did not actually have close genetic ties to one another. And given this, the researchers wrote in their study, "We cannot say that these tombs were the final resting places of a dynastic lineage who restricted access to burial within these tombs to their relatives." In other words, the wider network of supposed royal genetic connections that had seemed so damning in 2020 mostly dissolves once you look at a much bigger sample. This new reading weighs context, taphonomy, and settlement data alongside the genome results, and the researchers note that Newgrange's interior was actually disturbed for centuries before the 1960s excavation even began, complicating any claims about exactly where NG10 originally lay and what his positioning within the tomb actually meant socially. That detail alone should give you pause. If the chamber had already been disturbed for centuries before modern archaeologists ever laid eyes on it, how confident can anyone really be that NG10's placement at the heart of the monument reflected his original intended position rather than the accidental result of a millennium of later disturbance, looting, or reorganization by people who came long after him? The 2025 research team includes Professor Penny Bickle of the University of York and Professor Jessica Smith of University College Dublin, alongside collaborators from Ireland, the United Kingdom, and Australia, bringing both archaeological and genetic expertise to the table And rather than framing their conclusions as a dramatic contradiction of the 2020 paper, they zeroed in on something more subtle and, in some ways, more interesting. A genuine cultural shift that took place across the centuries these tombs were used. Archaeologists have identified 4 different kinds of ancient graves in Ireland, 3 simpler types used in the earlier part of the Neolithic, and a 4th type called the developed passage tomb that originated around 3300 BCE, the type of monument Newgrange itself belongs to. In the early Neolithic period, the smaller, simpler tombs are paralleled by genetic evidence showing smaller communities with much closer biological ties to each other. But in the later Neolithic, when people started building the larger, more elaborate passage tombs, most individuals buried there were actually more genetically diverse and more distantly related to one another. That shift is the real headline buried underneath all the incest drama. And honestly, it might be even more shocking than a single scandalous royal bloodline, because it describes an entire society transforming itself over centuries. Carlin explained that we argue that this reflects how the kin groups using these tombs were interacting on a larger scale and more frequently choosing to have children with others from within these extended communities, which paints a picture of early, close-knit farming villages gradually expanding outward, mixing, intermarrying across wider and wider circles, and eventually pooling their labor and their dead together inside monuments too massive for any single family to have built alone. What caused this shift isn't entirely clear, but the researchers suggest the clusters of passage tombs scattered across Neolithic Ireland show disparate groups of people coming together, perhaps seasonally, to participate in shared ceremonial activities. Instead of a Neolithic Ireland ruled by powerful dynasties, the researchers now argue for something closer to a more equal society, according to Carlin, a conclusion that essentially flips the original 2020 headline on its head. Not god kings hoarding power through incestuous bloodlines, but ordinary communities, expanding, intermixing, and building extraordinary shared monuments together, with NG10 representing an unusual, possibly brief, possibly misunderstood exception, rather than proof of an entire hidden royal class ruling over Stone Age Ireland. So, which version is actually true? This is where honest science gets messier and far more interesting than either headline alone. NG10 himself dates to somewhere between 3340 and 3020 BCE, meaning the man at the center of this entire controversy really did exist, really was born from an extremely close genetic union, and really was placed inside one of the most labor-intensive structures human beings had built anywhere on Earth at that point in history. That specific fact hasn't been overturned by anyone. What's being challenged is the massive leap the original team made from that one man's genome to an entire theory of hereditary Irish god kings ruling over a stratified dynastic society for centuries. The 2025 team isn't saying NG10 wasn't the product of incest. They're saying you can't build an entire civilization's political structure on the DNA of a single skeleton pulled from a tomb that was disturbed and reused for almost 1,000 years. Especially once you finally have 55 other skeletons to compare him against, and most of them show nothing resembling royal bloodlines at all. There's something almost poetic about how this story keeps refusing to settle into a tidy conclusion, and that unsettled quality is exactly what makes it worth understanding, rather than just repeating whichever headline sounds most dramatic. Ancient DNA analysis is still a relatively young scientific field, and the tools keep improving year after year, which means conclusions that felt airtight in 2020 can look considerably shakier by 2025 once bigger data sets, better statistical methods, and fresh archaeological context get applied to the same buried evidence. That's not a flaw in the science. That's exactly how good science is supposed to work. A single genome sparked a sensational theory about hidden Irish pharaohs. A larger, more careful data set 5 years later pulled that theory back down towards something more modest, more human, and in its own way more remarkable. An entire farming society over the course of roughly 4 centuries, learning to build bigger, work together across wider distances, and bury their dead inside monuments so massive that people thousands of years later would still be arguing over what they meant. And somewhere at the center of all of that unresolved argument still lies NG10 himself, a single man, born from an act that broke one of humanity's oldest taboos, placed with obvious care inside a carved stone chamber engineered to catch a beam of sunlight on one single morning each year, the winter solstice, when the sun's first light travels down a 19-meter passage and floods the chamber where he was laid to rest. Whether he was a god king whose bloodline once ruled an entire hidden dynasty, or simply one unusual, perhaps tragic individual, swept up in a much larger, more communal story that archaeologists are still piecing together. One thing about him has never been in dispute. 5,000 years after his birth, a few grams of bone pulled from deep inside his inner ear were enough to make the entire world stop and argue over exactly who he really was. Here's something almost nobody outside genetics circles knows, and it makes the NG10 story feel even smaller by comparison, because it turns out the Newgrange man wasn't just one strange skeleton in one unusual tomb. He was the descendant of an entire population that had already, quietly, violently, or not, replaced the people who came before it. And a separate genetic study, years before the Newgrange incest paper ever made headlines, proved it, using bones pulled from a tiny, windswept island off the coast of Northern Ireland. That study used the first whole genome data ever recovered from prehistoric Irish individuals, and it centered on a Neolithic woman, dated to between 3343 and 3020 BC, recovered from a megalithic burial site called Ballinahaddy, whose DNA was sequenced at over 10 times coverage, an unusually high-resolution genetic snapshot for remains this old. Researchers nicknamed her Maria. Maria's DNA carried traces of an even older population that had lived in Ireland before her, people who survived purely by hunting and gathering with no farming at all. But it was only a trace, leading scientists to conclude that Maria's farming ancestors had displaced and effectively replaced those original hunter-gatherers. That's the first replacement. An entire hunting and gathering way of life that Irish people had followed for thousands of years, quietly pushed aside by newcomer farmers arriving from the eastern Mediterranean world, carrying wheat, cattle, and a completely different way of living off the land. Here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you, though. Maria's DNA is almost entirely absent from the population of modern Ireland, meaning her people, the ones who replaced Ireland's original hunter-gatherers, and then went on to build astonishing monuments like Newgrange itself, were themselves later replaced by yet another wave of newcomers so thoroughly that barely a genetic trace of the Newgrange builders survives in Irish people walking around today. 2 replacements, not 1. The people who buried NG10 inside his elaborately carved chamber were not, genetically speaking, the direct ancestors of modern Ireland. They were a population that thrived, built extraordinary things, and then largely vanished from the family tree. The second wave of replacement is where things get even more dramatic, and it comes from 3 skeletons found on Rathlin Island, a tiny spit of volcanic rock in the channel between Ireland and Scotland, home today to barely 150 people. Rathlin Island has its own strange historical footnote too. In 795 AD, it had the dubious honor of being the first target of Viking raiding and pillaging anywhere in the British Isles, a place that seems to keep attracting pivotal, disruptive moments in history. 3 Bronze Age individuals recovered from Rathlin, dated to between 2026 and 1534 BC, including 1 genome sequenced at high coverage, showed substantial genetic heritage from the Pontic Steppe, the vast grasslands stretching from the Black Sea into Central Asia, indicating that the massive population upheavals sweeping across Europe during the 3rd millennium BC reached all the way from southern Siberia to the edge of the Western Ocean. Read that geography again. Genetic ancestry that originated on the steppes of southern Siberia in Ukraine had, within roughly 1,000 years, physically arrived on a tiny island off the coast of Ireland, carried there by generations of migrating populations moving steadily westward across the entire European continent. And the physical differences between these newcomers and the farmers they replaced were not subtle. Whereas Ireland's earlier Neolithic farmer had black hair, brown eyes, and features that more closely resembled populations from southern Europe, the genetic variants found circulating in the 3 Rathlin Island individuals included the most common Irish Y chromosome type known today, genetic variants for blue eyes, and a particular gene variant linked to hemochromatosis, an iron overload disorder so common among people of Irish descent that geneticists sometimes nickname it the Celtic disease. Black-haired, brown-eyed Neolithic farmers largely erased, blue-eyed Bronze Age, steppe migrants, arriving with a genetic disease variant that would go on to become a literal calling card of Irish ancestry for the next 4,000 years. If you know anyone of Irish descent who's ever mentioned a hemochromatosis diagnosis, that specific genetic quirk traces directly back to this population turnover on a tiny island barely visible on most maps of Ireland. The significance of that finding goes well beyond just eye color and iron metabolism, because it directly answers a question archaeologists had been arguing about for decades. There had been a decades-long unresolved controversy over whether population change or simple cultural adoption occurred at the Atlantic edge of Europe within the British Isles, when metalworking and Bronze Age technology first appeared. In other words, did new ideas simply spread to existing populations, who then adopted new tools and techniques on their own, or did entirely new people physically arrive and replace who was living there? The Rathlin genomes answered that question conclusively, and the answer wasn't gentle cultural diffusion. It was population replacement on a scale substantial enough to leave a genetic fingerprint still detectable in Irish, Scottish, and Welsh people thousands of years later. Study lead author Lara Cassidy of Trinity College Dublin put it plainly. Genetic affinity is strongest between the Bronze Age genomes and modern Irish, Scottish, and Welsh, suggesting establishment of central attributes of the insular Celtic genome some 4,000 years ago. 4,000 years ago, not from ancient Celtic tribes migrating out of Central Europe in the way popular history often assumes, but from steppe herders arriving centuries earlier, whose blood quietly became the genetic backbone of what we now casually call Celtic identity across 3 entire modern nations. Whether the ancestors of the Rathlin boys violently killed off Maria's Neolithic descendants may never be fully known, and it's likely nobody will ever be able to say for certain how much conflict, if any, accompanied this transition. But what is clear is that the newcomers brought a transformative new economic and agricultural technology with them, and that alone may have been enough to overwhelm the original population purely through numbers. If a Stone Age farming plot could only support around 2 people per square mile, while a Bronze Age farm using the newcomers' methods and metal tools could support 20, the demographic math alone would eventually favor the new arrivals, generation after generation, without a single sword needing to be drawn. That's a genuinely chilling way for an entire people to fade out of existence, not through massacre necessarily, but through simple, compounding demographic math, out-farmed and out-reproduced into genetic irrelevance over the span of a few centuries. So when you go back and picture NG10, the incestuous man laid carefully to rest at the heart of Newgrange, remember what he actually represents in the much longer arc of this story. He wasn't Ireland's first people. His ancestors had already replaced an entire hunter-gatherer civilization that came before them. And within centuries of his own death, his own farming culture, the one that raised 196,000 tons of earth and stone into a monument aligned perfectly with the winter solstice sun, would itself be swept aside by yet another wave of newcomers arriving from thousands of miles across the continent, carrying new metal, new genes, and a disease variant that Irish doctors still diagnose in their patients today. Ireland's ancient DNA doesn't just tell the story of one strange, incestuous man in one stone tomb. It tells the story of an island that was quietly, repeatedly, almost completely repopulated. Not once, but at least twice, long before anyone alive, today's ancestors ever set foot on its shores.